Good afternoon. I'm Linda Ferber, Museum Director Emerita of the New York Historical Society. And we thank those of you who are coming back from a truncated version of this lecture 2 weeks ago, and we welcome all of the newcomers this evening. My topic is an interesting one, the poetry of nature, Hudson River School landscapes from the collections of the New York Historical Society. But before we begin our discussion, I'd like to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other generous donors, some of whose gifts you will be seeing on the screen this evening. Your support allows the New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission. The New York Historical Society is currently open on Friday, Sunday, Saturday, and Sundays. So please reserve your time ticket entries on our website. Before we launch into our program, I want to let you know that it will last about 45 minutes, including about 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. We have disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use the Q&A function. And after the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. So to begin, may I have the next screen, please? Thank you. These works will range in date from 1818 to 1886. All but two are landscapes portraying American scenery. Most, but not all of them, are set in New York State in the vicinity of the Hudson River Valley, a region whose name is now associated with the style and vision known as the Hudson River School. The title poetry may be signaled in a landscape painting by the portrayal of mood via the time of day, the weather, play of light, by the title, and by evocative literary associations, all of which we'll see examples of here. These are two resonant portraits in this exhibition or this presentation, and they are, as you see, likenesses of Thomas Cole and Ashby Durand, the artists who might well be called the founding fathers of the Hudson River School. Both artists derived lifelong inspiration from the contemplation and study of nature in the Hudson River Valley and beyond. Not long after he painted this appealing self-portrait, Durand dedicated himself to landscape painting on the model of his younger mentor, Thomas Cole. After the untimely death in 1836 of Luman Reed, their mutual patron, who we recall gave Cole his long-sought commission to paint the course of empire, Cole urged Durand to leave his New York City studio and join him at Catskill to mourn together by communing with nature. The following summer, the two artists trekked with their wives to the more remote Adirondack mountain region. This experience was a turning point for Durand, who then abandoned portraiture to focus on landscape painting. This canvas demonstrates both Durand's skillfulness as a portrait painter and hints at his further ambition. He portrayed himself as a well-dressed gentleman holding a portfolio as an attribute that alludes to his already long-formed habit of sketching American scenery. Daniel Huntington's straightforward portrait of Thomas Cole portrayed the artist at 40 years of age, at the height of his career as the foremost painter of American scenery. By the mid-1840s, Cole and Durand had become competitors as well as colleagues. Cole's sudden death early in 1848 left Durand, who was by then president of the National Academy of Design, as the leader of the American Landscape School. Could we have the next slide, please? I will return to Cole and Durand and their works, but let's step back a moment to consider the fruitful environment in New York City that supported their careers as landscape painters. And there is no better example to demonstrate this than these two prints from the famous Hudson River portfolio. Cole and Durand were certainly not the first artists to record American scenery. In this endeavor, these landscape painters and their followers were united with their peers in the printmaking and literary communities. Beginning in the early 19th century, cultured Americans embraced the English rituals of picturesque touring, complete with the literature so important to this cultural practice. Illustrated publications extolled those American views that elicited a well-established set of aesthetic and emotional responses. The sublime signaled awe, the beautiful signaled harmony, and the picturesque charm. Tourists traveled, as they still do today, along a preset itinerary of natural and man-made landmarks deemed significant for scenic beauty or drama, for historical importance, or as demonstrations of national progress, towns, mills, dams, and canals. Many of these destinations also came associated with American national identity, as well as providing for spiritual enjoyment. Lavishly illustrated publications offered armchair travelers the vicarious experience of picturesque touring at home. And most famous among these are William Guy Wall's images in the Hudson River portfolio. 20 of Wall's watercolors were engraved by the master printmaker John Hill and colored by hand for the portfolio, which was published as a series in sections in New York City between 1821 and 1825, and thereafter as well. They were so popular. What you may not know is that there were bound versions of the Hudson River portfolio, and commentaries there accompanied each print, uniting word and image, both perfect examples of picturesque language. The text recreates the view in richly descriptive language to enlighten and entertain armchair travelers as they study the prints. Bound Hudson River portfolios with hand-colored prints were very much a deluxe consumer product, but the images also had even wider circulation as individual prints, and they were in essence the mass media of the day. This undertaking paved the way for many other similar projects, contributing to a wider public appreciation of landscape in the United States. The Hudson River portfolio was the first commercially successful series of such prints. The portfolio helped to stimulate national pride and cultural identity, and was so popular that it was reprinted in 1828. So Wall's images played a major role in creating the demand for paintings of American scenery, served by artists of the Hudson River School. So from the mass, could we have the next, please? Thank you. From the mass media, we now return back to high art. Only a single individual could own an oil painting. And we gain greater insight to these paintings when we understand the romantic tradition of this cult of nature, both the literary and the visual aspects of it. These paintings were received by their audience as a kind of painted poetry, the poetry of nature. In these cases here, one of the paintings inspired a poem and the other painting was inspired by a poem. Thomas Cole first journeyed up the Hudson River in the summer of 1825. In the Catskill Mountains, he made sketches for landscape paintings that launched his career, as well as the Hudson River School. In 1836, Cole left New York City to settle permanently at Catskill, the village on the west side of the Hudson that was a route to the touring and sketching grounds in the Catskill Mountains. Catskill Creek, or river, flowed into the Hudson not far from the point that we see here, near Cedar Grove, which was Cole's home. This vista looking west to the distant Catskill Range and featuring the distinctive shape of North Mountain became one of Cole's signature subjects. The still waters of Catskill Creek mirror the mountain profiles to the west, and the sky behind them is all suffused with twilight's glow. An eloquent writer as well as a painter, Cole had been inspired to celebrate this view in a poem called Sunset in the Catskills, written in 1838. And I'll just read you one or two lines. The valleys rest in shadow, and the hum of gentle sounds and two-tone melodies are stilled, and twilight spreads her misty wing, etc., etc. Durand's first fame was as an engraver. He then enjoyed success painting portraits, but his ultimate ambition was to paint the American landscape, drawing inspiration like his friend Cole from sketching in the Hudson River Valley and the Catskill Mountains. William Cullen Bryant was a close friend of both artists who were inspired by his nature poetry, as were many American artists. Even more important, by then, Bryant was also a prominent journalist and promoted the Hudson River School vigorously in his own newspaper, the New York Evening Post. Bryant's poetry inspired Primeval Forest, an extraordinary painting that evokes a lost masterpiece. This celebrated painting was based upon sketches made in the Ashokan forest, deep in the Catskill wilderness. Like Bryant's famous poem, A Forest Hymn, that had been written 3 decades earlier, Durand's painting venerated the shadowy solitude of the Catskills' ancient forests. This full-scale monochromatic oil study, which is called a cartoon, was the final step before creating the lost exhibition painting, which of course would have been painted with a full palette. A Forest Hymn is a long poem, so I'll just quote the first line and stanza to give you an idea of the mood that Durand captured. This is Bryant's poem. The groves were God's first temples, in the darkling wood, amidst the cool and silence. So the painting, like the poem, evokes what I call the solitary sublime. Could we have the next, please? The two artists were friendly competitors and had come to represent the two poles of the Hudson River School's landscape vision. American subjects like this one that I show you again brought Cole to his early and lasting fame and sales. His essay on American scenery of 1836 states eloquently that the appreciation of American scenery was important beyond being an acquired picturesque taste. It was, he said, a patriotic duty. But Cole had other artistic ambitions as well. Could I have the next, please? While Cole's fame as a painter of American scenery was secure by 1825, the artist always aspired to paint the historical landscapes that he considered what he called a higher style of landscape. These were subjects drawn from antiquity, literature, and the Bible, as well as allegorical themes. Mountain scenery is conceived in this higher style. It's an imaginary conflation of looming cliffs, plunging gorges, and massive ledges, reflecting Cole's fascination with using mountainous terrain as both an aesthetic and a narrative device. Similar forbidding landscapes appear in his early biblical subjects, and you will undoubtedly recognize elements in mountain scenery that appear in the first landscape of Cole's best-known allegorical series, The Course of Empire, and the first one portrays what's called the savage state. Could we have the next, please? Now consider Durand's commitment to American scenery with a quick look again at the cartoon for Durand's missing masterpiece, a perfect example of his vertical forest interiors. And if anyone ever comes across the color version of this painting, please call the New York Historical Society immediately. Could I have the next, please? Another mood and mode of Durand's interpretations of the Catskill region is his view of Shandaken Mountains. Durand was familiar with the rolling hills situated at the base of the mountains. It's a range of the Catskills in Ulster County. He visited the area frequently to sketch throughout the 40s and 50s. It's possible that the peak on the right is Slide Mountain, the highest point in the region. The winding stream and benign landscape with cows in the foreground now form the Ashokan Reservoir. This image of the Catskills' most lofty peak, rising from a comfortably domesticated foreground landscape, is very representative of Durand's fundamentally pastoral vision of nature, very different from Cole's dramatic, imaginary mountain sublime. May I have the next, please? There's a particular class of landscape in which collections of, by Durand, in which the collections of the New York Historical Society are extraordinarily rich. And those are his famous studies from nature. They're all about the same size. They're moderate. Sometimes they're vertical orientation. At other times, they're horizontal, as you see here. These are what were called foreground studies. There are others that take on different interpretations of the way in which the landscape was conformed. But the foreground studies are certainly particularly favorites of mine, and I think they are of many people. Because Durand was an early advocate of outdoor painting in America. In that way, he was, although he was older than his mentor, Thomas Cole, he was more progressive in embracing that tradition. Not that Cole never painted out of doors, but it was the center of Durand's vision and understanding of nature. In fact, he published his observations about plein air practice in his Letters on Landscape Painting, published in 1855 in The Crayon, which was America's first art magazine. He offered practical advice to the aspiring painter. The letters also expounded on Durand's own artistic process, as well as his strong beliefs about the spiritual power of nature, beliefs that were shared by his fellow artists and contemporaries. These two are remarkable. They're typical and remarkable in that they appear to be uncomposed, like snapshots. They're very close up with very bold cropping and very, very precise geological and botanical detail. Could I have the next, please? Like Cole, Durand had a major influence. Walters, Mary Josephine Walters, is obviously, she was a professional woman artist. Little is known about her life, but she is one of the few documented students of Durand. She traveled with Durand and his family to the painting grounds of the Hudson River School, and the elder artist's influence is evident in her forest scene here. Interestingly, this painting was purchased by the New York Historical Society in 1888. You'll notice the numbers at the bottom of each of the captions, and the first 4 digits before you get to the periods, will tell you the year of acquisition. It was unusual for the society to acquire work by a woman, but I have always suspected that it was in tribute to her master, Durand, who had died in 1886 and whose work was already very well represented in the Society's collection. And he had also chaired the art committee of the New York Historical Society at a point in his career. Now, Worthington Whitridge was born near Springfield, Ohio, and he painted landscapes and portraits in Cincinnati as a young man before traveling to Europe in 1849, where he remained for almost a decade. He returned to the United States and settled in New York City, launching a successful career as a landscape painter, taking his cues from Durand's vertical forest scenes, as you can see here, and the poetry of William Cullen Bryant. In A Forest Stream, the artist depicts woodland scenery, like Walters, possibly in the Catskills, and experiments with the effects of sunlight filtering through the dense forest canopy to create a luminous reflection in the winding waterway. Now, according to the artist's own account, he wrote a wonderful autobiography, which is really interesting reading. It was during a visit to the New York Historical Society in 1859 that Whitridge saw paintings by Cole and Durand that inspired him to seek out pristine nature. Durand's influence is especially evident here in Whitridge's masterful use, like Walters, of Durand's signature vertical format. Could I have the next, please? Now we'll take a brief look at some of Cole and Durand's fellow artists on an art historical journey up the Hudson. From its origins at Lake Tear in the Clouds, high in the Adirondacks, the river flows some 315 miles south to New York Harbor. The region surrounding the stretch of river between New York and Albany figured prominently in the literary, poetic, and artistic imagination of the young nation. The combination of picturesque, historic, and literary associations established the river valley as a tourist destination with its varied scenery, weather, and effects of life, all agents of what we are calling the poetry of nature. But the Hudson River School story begins in the vast natural harbor at the mouth of the Hudson that determined New York's rise as a great port, generating much of the wealth that made the city a global commercial power and a cultural center. Hudson River School artists returned from summer sketching to New York studios where important patrons and exhibition opportunities awaited. The busy harbor itself attracted marine and coastal painters like Silva. The artist chose the day's end when the glow of sunset transformed the busy port into a romantic vision. Silva presents a radiant expanse of reflective water with a medley of graceful sails silhouetted against the twilight sky. A sturdy tugboat approaches, its prominent smokestack a reminder of the passing of sail to steam power. It was lamented as far less picturesque, but that same power, of course, propelled the fleets of steamboats carrying tourists and artists up and down the Hudson. At the height of his career in the 1860s, Cropsey had purchased 45 acres in Warwick, New York, where he designed and built a mansion called Aladdin. Somewhat odd name, but nevertheless. No odder, I guess, really, than Frederick Church's Olana. Cropsey made sketches and studies there for many paintings of the local scenery in all seasons. This luminous twilight vision of Greenwood Lake, a favorite subject nearby the house, evokes a nostalgic mood that by then might suggest a realization of the waning popularity of the Hudson River School aesthetic. Cropsey's own declining fortunes forced the sale of Aladdin in 1884, and he then settled on the east side of the river on a smaller property at Hastings-on-Hudson, building Everrest, a charming studio house that can still be visited today. Next, please. Continuing up the river, the 22-year-old Boughton wisely selected this classic view of the Hudson Highlands for his first major landscape effort. Boughton's ambitious canvas delineates the remains of Fort Putnam, which is the wall that you see in the immediate foreground. It was a famous Revolutionary War stronghold near what is now and was then the United States Military Academy at West Point. Visiting tourists stand upon the ruined walls, reinforcing the relic's historical significance and suggesting Fort Putnam's new role now as a picturesque attraction. Before his departure for study in Europe, Thomas Hiram Hotchkiss had ranged the sketching grounds of the Hudson River School. Under Durand's influence, this native of the Hudson River Valley also painted steadily out of doors. This landscape demonstrates the young artist's mastery of a precise yet painterly touch, combining the classic Catskill Mountain profile with a middle distance and a foreground abounding with human life and harvest labor, all in harmonious balance with nature. In 1860, Hotchkiss traveled to Europe and settled permanently in Italy, where he painted luminous views of the Roman Campagna. He died an untimely death from tuberculosis, leaving a small but very impressive body of work to be cared for by the Durand family, who ultimately donated his paintings and works on paper to the society. Next, please. Jarvis Mcentee, many of his paintings feature the scenery surrounding his native Rondout, just south of Kingston on the west bank of the Hudson River. The artist made studies there that he developed in his New York studio into the slightly melancholy meditations on the seasons, subdued in both palette and mood, for which he was and is so well known. Despite the solitary nature of works like this overcast autumnal view, Mcentee himself operated at the center of New York's art world for many years, keeping a diary that is essential reading about the private lives of the American Landscape School. It's available online. It's at the Archives of American Art. And I've always thought of the diary as sort of Hudson River School confidential. Casselier was inspired by the influence of Cole, Kensett, and Durand to retire from the business of engraving in the 1850s. To take up landscape painting. He sketched every summer with artist friends in the Catskills. The artist was recognized especially for his serene images bathed in a skillfully rendered, delicate, silvery haze. And if you look closely on the right, on the center left edge, you can see a young woman enjoying the view of the Catskills beyond the autumnal trees. Could I have the next, please? Catskill Clove, also known as Catskill Clove, is a spectacular gorge in the heart of the Catskills that was a hallowed subject for 2 generations of Hudson River School artists. Durand's painting depicts the clove from a distant height, following the panoramic vista of heavily forested mountains and tracing the winding course of Catskill Creek. The rift runs from west to east, past villages where artists and tourists could find modest accommodations, and not far from the luxury lodgings of the famous Catskill Mountain House, so that the trappings of tourism stimulated a booming industry supporting picturesque touring, which it still does. In October 1848, Durand reported the presence of no fewer than 9 other artists working with him in the Clove, despite the very cold weather. A decade later, Hotchkiss followed in his master's footprints to the Clove. This vigorous little tree study is a brilliant exercise in plein air painting, testifying to Durand's influence on a promising young painter. The next, please. The heavily glaciated and forested terrain of the Adirondacks in northern New York State offered an even more dramatic mountain landscape than the Catskills. Source of the Hudson River rose in the mountain range. At Gilded Age, wealthy industrialists built elaborate compounds known as great camps, some of which are preserved today as historic site. But Durand's panoramic view of Adirondack, Forest Lake, and this distant mountain range invokes solitude, not society. The Hudson River, the Adirondack Park and Forest Preserve was set aside by New York State in 1892 to remain forever wild. And it's an extraordinary, obviously, the Hudson River School, the imagery of the Hudson River School played a role in this, in identifying this particular terrain as something that was worthy of preservation as a national resource and inspiration. Could I have the next, please? Niagara Falls, perhaps the best known of North American scenic wonders, straddles the border between New York State and Canada. Tourist travel to the falls expanded greatly after the completion of the Erie Canal, but their fame was so great that a number of artists and others made the trek long before. Louisa Davis Minot of Boston wrote about her journey in the North American Review and painted an impressive pair of Niagara views in 1818, of which this is one. She wrote, "The roar deepened, the rocks shook over my head, the earth trembled," which gives you a wonderful sort of equivalent of what you see here. And the notion of the literary picturesque and the visual picturesque. In this case, of course, it's the sublime. She seemingly suspends the viewer above the river's gorge. She focuses her brush on the torrents of water plunging over the cliffs and the roiling rapids and vapors at the base of the falls. 2 men on a rocky promontory are dwarfed by the spectacle before them. By emphasizing the overwhelming scale and power of the falls in comparison to these tiny figures, Minot's image evokes the sublime, or the awesome experience for which Niagara was and still is famous. We have the next, please. The next screen, please. Now, just a couple of quick looks at the seasons. The cycles of nature were central to poetry, still are, and to landscape painting. They were popular themes for both in the 19th century. The seasons signal time. They signal beginnings and endings of a year. There are different labors associated with different months. And the whole association of the cyclical nature of nature is a very powerful metaphor for, of course, human life. And as a young artist, William T. Richards revered the landscape vision of the Hudson River School. For a brief time in the 1860s, however, he altered his technique in response to the English critic John Ruskin's call for absolute fidelity to nature, which you see working in his June Woods of 1864. Nevertheless, Richard's choice of a vertical format also demonstrates his continuing allegiance to Durand's influential model for portraying the forest interior. Now, the homesteads and rural landscapes of Durand, of Durry's native Connecticut, I told you we weren't going to completely stay in New York State, inspired this artist's ideal views of simple New England farm life, often evoking the seasonal labors of the month, and winter was Durry's specialty. This work may look familiar. His appealing winter genre scenes gained widespread popularity when colored prints after his paintings were published by Courier and Ives, back to mass media, in 1861. And indeed, Durry's charming snow scenes are still familiar to us from Christmas cards and calendars, demonstrating again the power of mass media in replicating and popularizing images. May I have the next, please? There is one season, Thomas Cole wrote in his 1836 essay on American scenery, which you can find online, and I recommend it. It's wonderful reading. When the American forest surpasses all the world in gorgeousness, Cole said, that is the autumnal. Now, while Bierstadt is best known for his large canvases of the American West, we have a wonderful one in the collection at the Society, he was also responsive to the brilliant fall scenery of upstate New York. Indeed, the artist also built a studio house on the Hudson at Irvington. It was called Malkasten. It was just up the hill from where Lyndhurst still exists. It was a fabulous house, and it burned to the ground in 1882, alas. I've been there. We saw some of the granite foundations of the house, but it is no more, although there are some wonderful photographs of it taken by Bierstadt's brothers. In this painting, quiet waters mirroring the trees fill the foreground. In this grand yet tranquil, you can see the measurements, autumnal vista, which was not far from Waterville, which was the birthplace of Durand's first wife and great love, Rosalie Osborne. For decades, the peripatetic artist maintained a country studio there where he kept carefully organized archives of his plein air sketches and worked on large paintings. We're very lucky that he had a studio both in New York City and the studio at Waterville, because when Malkasten burned, his collections of Indian artifacts, many sketchbooks, many paintings were also destroyed. Could I have the next, please? Now, I want to begin to close our survey very appropriately with a sunrise and a sunset, evoking once again the powerful associations of the times of day, both in painting and in poetry. Although Kensett joined his fellow Hudson River School artists at traditional sketching grounds, he was also drawn to the Atlantic coast. He was one of the first major landscape painters to develop a strong interest in painting coastal terrain, a subject, interestingly, whose popularity grew as seaside tourism developed in the second half of the 19th century. In the first half of the 19th century and earlier, the seaside or the coast was basically places where terrible wrecks took place, and they provided subjects for marine paintings. But as seaside tourism developed in the second half of the 19th century, the landscape was seen as, the coastal landscape was seen as the perfect environment for meditation. And of course, what followed was the growth of a booming hotel and resort industry, which we still enjoy. Sunset on the Coast portrays an isolated New England coastline, not identified and unpopulated, but for a solitary waterfowl that you might just see in the right lower corner of the painting. The mood here is one of poetic meditation. Distant sails on the horizon do nothing to dispel the sense of seclusion on a remote shore washed by waves and bathed in the glow of the setting sun. Sontag's evocative landscape portrays the sunrise over that portion of the Appalachian Range known for its distinctive blue haze, an effect caused by the densely forested slopes. Morning in the Blue Ridge is one of Sontag's most important paintings, a commemoration of his early sketching forays into Kentucky and Virginia. He was from Cincinnati, and this ambitious panoramic mountain vista was painted soon after he relocated to New York and was displayed at the National Academy of Design. And you can see that he's already very familiar with the Hudson River School formula. Could I have the next, please? And we see Morning in the Blue Ridge again, and introduce Robert S. Duncanson, who you may know is one of only a very few 19th century African-American artists to create a successful career as well as an international reputation. He was born in New York State, but he relocated to Cincinnati in the early 1840s, and he was inspired by the work of Sontag. He also worked as a daguerreotypist, and he painted portraits and decorative murals. He embarked on his first trip to Europe, of which this is an evocation, with Sontag. He also was inspired by both Sontag and the Hudson River School painters to produce many landscapes of the Ohio River Valley. But he was influenced as well by the artistic traditions he encountered abroad, some of them going right back to the early 19th century. They fueled his fascination with the work of Thomas Cole. Now, he was in Cincinnati and Cole operated in New York, but Duncanson worked in the historical mode, which we see here, as a higher style of landscape. He is evoking a sort of an antique landscape, a poetic moment, and it is similar in mood to Cole's. Could I have the next slide, please? Dream of Arcadia. Now, the backstory of the Dream of Arcadia is really fascinating. Cole may have given this work to Asher B. Durand in gratitude for a portrait that Cole painted of him as a wedding gift. And the painting itself is a testament to the close friendship of two artists at the vanguard of the Hudson River School. It reveals Cole's fascination with trompe-l'oeil imagery. Do you notice he portrays, it's a sketch of his monumental history painting, Dream of Arcadia, which is in the Denver Art Museum, as if he's putting down his first thoughts of the painting, as if it were a small oil sketch on paper. Notice the way the edges curl, literally pinned informally to the wooden wall of a studio. Now, this painting, the finished work in Denver, had a very long afterlife. It was widely known through an engraving of 1850 that provided the model for many copies, including a large one by Duncanson himself, which is now in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum. But Cole's influence is evident here as well in Duncanson's Italian landscape with ruins, again evoking sort of the temple at Tivoli and kind of a golden age, a pastoral peace and harmony in nature. But I want to close first to show you that this is these are pendants. They're a pair. May I have the next slide, please? Here are the two lovely landscapes by Duncanson, properly framed. These are not original frames, but they are frames of the period, and they're small, as you can see. And the fascinating thing was the first time I installed them in the galleries, because they came into the collections during my time as museum director, they were hung. We stacked a group of smaller paintings, and we surmounted the stack with these two paintings. And it was amazing that they're oval, the fact that they were ovals, although they were very diminutive, and the way in which the light just kind of glowed out of those golden, gilded frames made them, everybody who walked into the gallery, their eyes went right away to the two smallest objects in the gallery, which I thought was really fascinating. They're ornamental as well as evocative. And he would have been aware of these. Could I have the next and last slide, please? He would have been aware of this, because I can't resist leaving New York and heading west to Cincinnati to show you the Belmont landscape murals executed around 1850, 1852 in Cincinnati. They are an ensemble. This is two of an ensemble of 8 large landscapes. Each of these is about 7 by 9 feet in dimension. They're in elaborate frames that are rendered, however, in a completely trompe-l'oeil style, like the curling edges of the sketch in Thomas Cole's landscape. We believe that earlier in his career, Duncanson was a decorative painter. and these must have been his masterpieces. They were commissioned by Nicholas Longworth, a very important Cincinnati patron, and the mansion Belmont, which they graced, they were painted on the plaster walls of the grand foyer of the house. It's a Center Hall house. And I had seen them in reproduction for many years, and they're justly admired, and they are a remarkable survival. They were overpainted, probably more than once. And then during different times during the 20th century, because the house comprises sort of the central structure of the Taft Museum of Art in Cincinnati, they were not only uncovered, but they were restored. And seeing them here is impressive, but standing in front of them when I went out to give this lecture, as a matter of fact, in Cincinnati 2 years ago, I was stunned, absolutely stunned. And it shows he exercises all of the vocabularies of landscape painting that we have seen. The Arcadian, here he's suggesting a New World, a more of a sublime landscape, but the arcaded bridge and the structures of what looks like a sort of an early Italian city and the other, they are very much not only decorative murals, but they're also poetic evocations. But I do have to confess that the frames fascinate me as much as the painting. He also created overdoors for the door between the top of the door and the ceiling in the same space. It's really an amazing experience. So they are not actually topographically accurate, but all of them are evocative of both Old World and New World scenery. They're suggestive. They're not explicit, as is completely appropriate for what we've been talking about this evening, the poetry of nature. And now, if there's time left, I'm happy to respond to questions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ferber. Our first question is, how, if at all, do foreground studies relate to the later American Pre-Raphaelite paintings?
Good question. The commonality in Durand's sudden interest in focusing on painting out of doors in this very, very meticulous way was in response to a series of books that were published beginning in the early 1840s by the great English critic John Ruskin. And in those, it was called, the series is called Modern Painters. And his foe in modern painters, in other words, his foil, were the traditional Arcadian landscapes of Claude Lorraine and Salvator Rosa, the system of the sublime, the beautiful, and the picturesque. He sought to strike that down as the center of British and all landscape painting, and to replace it with the artist's individual, careful experience in front of nature itself. If you painted a cloud, you had to tell us, is it cumulus? Is it cirrus? If you painted a rock, you need to be able to tell what geological formation it was. When you painted trees and flora, and you had to make it specific so that people could identify. It was as if you were merging painting with a kind of almost scientific accuracy, but that accuracy would lead you to a kind of spiritual experience before nature that was transformative, so that the ideal, in a sense, lay in the intense scrutiny of the real and the actual. And Durand responded to that. He began to paint in the 1840s. He began a regular production of the studies from nature. So he is, I won't say he's a forerunner of the American Pre-Raphaelites, because they actually scolded him. They didn't think he was quite detailed enough, but it is that Ruskinian moment in American painting and in American culture, indeed, which really ran from the early 1840s right up to the end of the 19th century.
Wonderful. Our next, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here.
Sure.
We have some questions wanting to know how large the collection is, how much is actually on display, and we had several people wanting to know whether in the collection we have any paintings by Frederick Edwin Church.
Yes. I'll start with the easy answer first. Yes. We have a spectacular painting by Church. It is one of his great South American views. It's Cotopaxi. It's not Cotopaxi, at any rate. It's one of the extinct volcanoes in Ecuador that formed the subject of so many of his spectacular views. It's small, but it packs a wallop. I mean, it's like a workup for Heart of the Andes, which is massive in scale and phenomenal in detail. And the earlier painting, Cayambe, is in a sense just as powerful, although it's tiny by comparison to Heart of the Andes. And then in about 5 years ago, we were immensely fortunate. It was unfortunate circumstances, but a marvelous collector had passed away, and in his honor, his wife and family wished to give a collection of American paintings that they had formed to the New York Historical Society as a promised gift, which was so exciting. And working with them was great. And then, alas, his wife passed away quite suddenly. And so we were astonished. The paintings came to us much sooner than we thought they would, and certainly hoped that they would. And though that included what we did not have in the way of the works of Church, which is a spectacular early American view. What we were missing, in a sense, from the narrative of the collection was a work portraying. It's actually, I'm trying to remember. Oh, it's the New England coast, an island off the New England coast, it's a marvelous painting, and it is kind of it's a settlement in the wilderness. It's a sublime landscape with a house in it, and it rehearses that kind of theme, which was so important to the work of Church, and something also to his own teacher and mentor, Thomas Cole. And then you have this consummate Cayambe South American landscape. So it was a great. It was a great moment. It was a sad moment, but we have been showing and touring a number of the paintings. Also, the Worthington Whitridge that we saw of the forest interior also came from that collection. I am remembering around 3,500 paintings. It could be more now. I've been gone since 2005, but I'm still senior art historian, so I am in touch with folks. And I also would say, if you want me to tell you how much of the collection is on view, I would say very, very little. Most museums with large collections, only a small percentage is on view. However, our traveling exhibition program, of which this exhibition is one, has brought our collections. My feeling was, if I don't have the galleries to show my collection, I'll show my collection, excuse me for the curatorial I'll show my collection in the galleries of other museums and other places. And it turned out to be a great idea. We called it modestly Sharing a National Treasure. And in fact, an iteration of this exhibition is open even as we speak in Vero Beach, Florida, in case you're heading for warmer climes. So I am not at all sure. I'm shaky on the total number of paintings or might say American paintings or paintings in the collection. But the Newman collection was a great addition of wonderful American landscapes. We have a great Heed hummingbird picture, which many of you know probably. Like Cayambe, it came from the collection of Robert L. Stewart, a great 19th century New York collector whose collection came to the New York Historical Society. And So as in essence, traveling these exhibitions has proven to be a great boon. And you probably all are here this evening, so it won't shock you that, as we would say in the garment industry, the hot ticket is very much the Hudson River School. And we are so fortunate to have such deep collections that we have a couple of different versions of pulling together works from our landscape collections that we're able to send out. Would that we had more on view in our own museum. And there's always a lot of excitement when there's an opportunity to show the permanent collection, which we very much love to do. But while they are not, it's lovely to take them out of the dark also and send them out to do good things for American painting and to do good things for the New York Historical Society.
That's great. A little birdie told me that we have about 3,000 paintings. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, little birdie. Where were you when I needed you? I should have had earphones in,
So I think we have such great questions, but I'm afraid we've only got time for one more. I am going to ask, we have someone who encountered some Hudson River School paintings in Madrid. And so the question was, how expansive or pervasive was the influence of the school outside of the United States?
Well, that's a great question. There's probably a visit to the Thyssen-Bornemisza museum. And the Baron Thyssen, who was the founder of that museum, and it was during his lifetime, it was at his villa in Switzerland, was a great fan of historic American painting, 19th, he and his wife, and they developed a great interest. And I think we probably have to thank, if any of you know the name of Barbara Novak, a great art historian, one of the pioneers in establishing American painting as a worthy and important discipline, and with whom I had the privilege to study. And there was an encounter, and he was enchanted by what he saw. And they have, it's a great museum of European painting and contemporary American and European painting, but with a very, very strong component of what we call historic American paintings, which is terrific. There are other museums. The Tate has begun to collect American painting, both of the 19th century and 20th century. The Louvre has American paintings. Of course, they have Whistler's Mother, which came in the 19th century. And there are museums in Germany are fascinated. I participated in an enormous exhibition with a well, nobody does telephone books anymore, but it was like the size of the Manhattan telephone book. It was a huge, wonderful catalog, both in English and in German, on 19th century American painting, which was about 3 years ago, to which the Society was a very, very generous lender. And then there was an exhibition at the Fondation Juan March, in a private foundation that shows that is dedicated to cultural events. And we sent from our collections alone an exhibition of the works of Asher B. Durand that was a huge hit in Madrid, where they had really never seen his work before. So it's, as I said, it's really exciting to travel. There's always been a great deal of work in contemporary American art, starting with abstract expressionism up. But now there is an equally strong interest in historical American art as well, in Europe and beyond, Japan, Australia. So anyone else? Or we run out of time. And I want to let you know, I have been assigned to let you know that on March the 24th, the next episode of Curator Confidential will be cover story, Catherine Graham, CEO, with Jean Gutierrez, who's a curatorial scholar in the Women's History Department at the New York Historical Society. So thank you all, and have a good evening.